There are periods in Earth's history that are difficult to imagine not because they are remote, but because they are radically alien to any experience a human being can have of the world. The Jurassic, with its giant dinosaurs, is strange but recognizable. Large animals in landscapes that, though exotic, have trees and skies and oceans not completely different from ours. But the Carboniferous is something else entirely. The Carboniferous is a world so different from the current one that traveling to it would be like traveling to another planet. The Carboniferous also teaches something important about the relationship between the physical environment and the diversity of life. The high oxygen, the warm humid tropics, the vast swamp geography created by the low-relief Pangea landscape in formation. Those physical conditions were not simply background conditions within which evolution played out. They were active participants in shaping what forms of life were possible, what sizes organisms could reach, what ecological roles could be filled. When those conditions changed at the Carboniferous's end, the forms of life that had been optimized for them had to change or disappear. The lesson: life is always a conversation between organism and environment, not a one-way story of adaptation. There is also something serene in the strangeness of the Carboniferous. It is a world so alien to any human concern that exploring it is like stepping outside our timescale and our problems into something infinitely vaster and older. The lycopsid forests and giant amphibians know nothing of any of the things occupying our minds in daily life. They are simply life, doing what life does, on a planet that at that moment was still 300 million years away from producing the first mind capable of remembering them. The Carboniferous is also the period that most clearly demonstrates one of the deepest principles of paleontology, that the current state of life on Earth is not the inevitable result of a predetermined evolutionary trajectory, but the product of specific historical contingencies that could have gone differently at many points. If the oxygen-producing Carboniferous forests had not existed, there would have been no giant insects, no coal, no industrial revolution fueled by that coal. If the amniote egg had not evolved, no reptile, no dinosaur, no mammal, no human would have existed. The entire history of complex terrestrial life pivots on a series of evolutionary innovations that occurred in the Carboniferous, and each of those innovations was not guaranteed by the laws of evolution but was one of many possible outcomes. The Carboniferous is also unusual among geological periods in that its most direct legacy in the modern world is not biological but industrial. While other periods are known primarily for the organisms they produced, the Carboniferous is known equally for the coal it created. That coal, burned over the last 2 centuries to power the Industrial Revolution and its successors, has made the Carboniferous one of the geological periods most consequential for modern human civilization, for better and for worse. The Carboniferous is also the period of the Great Oxygen Paradox, a world that produced the oxygen we breathe, through processes that we have since reversed by burning the carbon those same forests buried. A world that invented the egg allowing us to exist, through organisms that we would barely recognize as our ancestors. A world that built the coal that built our civilization, and that is now returning to the atmosphere as the carbon dioxide reshaping our climate. The Carboniferous is not just ancient history. It is the geological chapter most directly relevant to understanding the present. 300 million years ago, the continents were slowly joining to form Pangea. Oxygen in the atmosphere reached 35%, compared to the 21% today, which meant the air was almost twice as rich in oxygen as what we breathe now. The tropics were covered by forests of a scale and composition that have no equivalent in the modern world. Trees 30 meters tall that were not trees in the sense we understand today, but giant lycopsids, plants that in the current world exist only as small creeping herbs on forest floors. Tree-like horsetails 20 meters high. Seed ferns that formed dense canopies at mid-height between the giants of the floor and the sky. And in those forests lived creatures that also have no equivalent in the modern world. Dragonflies with wingspans of 70 centimeters, nearly as large as modern seagulls, hunting in the air as the most efficient predators of their ecosystem. Millipedes 2.5 meters long moving through the forest leaf litter like small trains. Aquatic scorpions the size of a human being inhabiting rivers and swamps. 3-meter amphibians with flat heads and enormous mouths waiting motionless in the dark swamp water, as patient as the crocodiles that would come hundreds of millions of years later. That world, the Carboniferous, lasted from approximately 359 million years ago until approximately 299 million years ago. 60 million years of swampy forests, giant insects, and dominant amphibians, an era that ended with a climate crisis that transformed the planet and opened the way to the Permian and eventually to the world of dinosaurs and mammals. The strangeness of the Carboniferous is not only visual. It is also chemical, atmospheric, auditory. The Carboniferous air had a different composition from ours. The sounds of the Carboniferous were different from those of any current ecosystem, without birds singing, without mammals making nocturnal noises, only the buzzing and crackling of arthropods and the wind through the leaves of the lycopsids. The smell of the Carboniferous, if we could transport ourselves there, would be that of a warm swamp saturated with decomposing organic matter, without the flowers that perfume the air of modern ecosystems. Tonight we are going to walk through that world with the slowness it deserves. We are going to look up at the lycopsid giants from below, toward the canopy 30 meters above. We are going to follow a meganeura on its hunting flight over the swamp. We are going to pause at the moment the first amniote lays the first egg that does not need water to survive. And we are going to end with the Carboniferous still alive beneath our feet, in the coal that formed the Industrial Revolution and in the oxygen we breathe tonight. Settle in. We are going to travel 300 million years back. To understand the Carboniferous, one must begin with oxygen. Not because oxygen is the only factor defining that period, but because it is the factor most conditioning everything else, from animal sizes to fire frequency, from forest structure to the physiology of the organisms inhabiting them. There is also a connection between the Carboniferous oxygen levels and the evolution of the vertebrate respiratory system that is worth exploring. The ancestors of all terrestrial vertebrates, the Devonian fish that first ventured onto land, already had rudimentary lungs in addition to gills, probably as an adaptation for surviving in low-oxygen swamp waters. Those lungs were the starting point for the diverse respiratory systems of terrestrial vertebrates. The oxygen record of the Carboniferous is preserved not only in isotope ratios but also in the physical properties of the charcoal in coal deposits. Experimental combustion studies show that charcoal forms only when oxygen exceeds approximately 16% of the atmosphere. Above that threshold, charcoal formation rates increase with oxygen concentration. By calibrating the charcoal content of Carboniferous coals against those experimental relationships, geochemists can estimate the atmospheric oxygen of the period with increasing precision, confirming the high oxygen levels that the geochemical models predict. The atmospheric oxygen of the Carboniferous also had consequences for the evolution of plant physiology. High oxygen levels mean that the ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is high, and that ratio affects the efficiency of plant photosynthesis. The enzyme responsible for carbon fixation in photosynthesis, rubisco, can react with either carbon dioxide or oxygen, and when oxygen levels are high relative to carbon dioxide, more rubisco reactions produce wasteful products rather than useful sugars, a process called photorespiration. Carboniferous plants would have experienced more photorespiration than modern plants, which may have been one of the factors driving the evolution of more efficient photosynthetic strategies in plants after the Carboniferous. In the high oxygen atmosphere of the Carboniferous, those lungs did not need to be extraordinarily efficient to keep their owners alive. Oxygen diffused easily into the lungs and from there into the bloodstream. The refinement of the vertebrate respiratory system, the development of the flow-through respiratory system of birds that is the most efficient known, or the development of the diaphragm-powered breathing of mammals, were driven partly by the challenges of surviving in lower oxygen environments. challenges that became more acute as the Carboniferous's high oxygen levels gave way to the lower levels of the Permian and Triassic. In the Carboniferous, Earth's atmosphere contained approximately 35% oxygen by volume, compared to 21% today. That oxygen increase was not random. It was the direct result of the expansion of Carboniferous forests and a biochemical peculiarity of wood that would only be resolved millions of years later. The high oxygen also meant that early Carboniferous animals could be more active than their Devonian predecessors. Aerobic metabolism is more energetically efficient than anaerobic metabolism, and more oxygen means more aerobic capacity. The amphibians of the Carboniferous, with their partially cutaneous respiration absorbing oxygen through the skin, benefited directly from the enriched atmosphere. The Meganeura, with its diffusion-based respiratory system, could not have achieved its size in any other atmospheric composition in Earth's history. In a real sense, the biological richness of the Carboniferous was atmospheric before it was biological. The oxygen came first, and the giant forms followed. Carboniferous plants, especially the giant lycopsids and seed ferns, produced enormous quantities of wood as they grew. That wood was composed mainly of lignin and cellulose, the same compounds forming modern wood. But in the Carboniferous, the organisms capable of decomposing lignin, mainly certain groups of fungi, had not yet evolved or were not abundant and efficient enough to decompose all the dead wood the forests produced. The result was that when Carboniferous trees died, they did not decompose completely. Their trunks and branches fell into the swamps, were covered by sediment, and instead of being returned to the carbon cycle as carbon dioxide through decomposition, that carbon remained buried in the sediments. That massive burial of organic carbon, which continued for tens of millions of years, had two direct consequences. First, it reduced atmospheric carbon dioxide because the carbon that would have returned as CO2 was now buried. Second, it increased atmospheric oxygen because plants kept producing oxygen through photosynthesis without that oxygen being consumed by dead wood decomposition. The consequences of that high oxygen level were not limited to insect size. Oxygen is also the element necessary for combustion, and an atmosphere with 35% oxygen is one in which fires occur far more easily than in today's atmosphere. The evidence of fires in the Carboniferous fossil record, in the form of fossil charcoal produced by incomplete combustion and preserved in sediments, is extraordinarily abundant compared to any other geological period. That suggests forest fires were a very important ecological element in the Carboniferous, shaping forest structure and the survival strategies of the organisms inhabiting them. That carbon buried during the Carboniferous is the coal that powered the Industrial Revolution. Most of the world's coal deposits in Europe, North America, China were formed precisely in this period, which explains the period's name. Carboniferous literally means carbon-bearing. When we burn coal, we are releasing in a matter of centuries the carbon those forests took tens of millions of years to bury. That high oxygen concentration fundamentally changed the possibilities of life on land. Oxygen is necessary for animal metabolic processes, and higher oxygen concentration means body tissues can be supplied with oxygen with less effort. For insects, whose respiratory system works by diffusion through tubes called tracheae with no active pumping mechanism, higher atmospheric oxygen means oxygen can diffuse more deeply into the body, allowing larger bodies. The Carboniferous forests are one of the most extraordinary ecosystems the Earth has ever produced. Not in terms of species diversity, because modern tropical forests surpass them in that respect, but in terms of composition and scale, which has no equivalent in the current world. The ecology of the Carboniferous forest also had distinct dynamics in its different layers. The canopy, dominated by the spreading crowns of the giant lycopsids, was a high-light environment where the most intense competition for photosynthetic resources occurred. The midstory, where tree ferns and climbing plants competed for the filtered light passing through the lycopsid crowns, was a space of intense biological activity. And the floor, receiving the least light of all, was dominated by organisms that did not depend on photosynthesis but instead made their living from the decomposing organic matter falling from above. The Carboniferous fossil plant record has also been crucial for establishing the deep evolutionary history of some of the most important biochemical pathways in modern plants. The secondary metabolites that plants produce as defenses against herbivores and pathogens, many of which are the active compounds in traditional medicines and modern pharmaceuticals, have their evolutionary origins in the Paleozoic. The terpenes that give conifers their distinctive scent and that are the basis of many pharmaceutical compounds, the phenylpropanoids that form lignin and also many flavonoids with medicinal properties, were already being produced by Carboniferous plants in forms that the fossil record preserves as distinctive chemical signatures in the rock. The reproductive biology of the giant lycopsids also tells us something important about why they ultimately could not survive the changing conditions of the late Carboniferous. Unlike the first conifers that were beginning to appear, lycopsids could not produce their spores without abundant water in the environment. Their spore germination required consistently moist conditions. As the climate became more seasonal and drier, the windows of opportunity for successful spore germination became fewer and shorter. The conifers, with their seeds that could remain dormant for extended dry periods and germinate when conditions eventually improved, were fundamentally better suited to the increasingly seasonal climate of the late Carboniferous. It was not that the lycopsids were outcompete in any direct sense. It was that the rules of the game changed in ways that favored seeds over spores. That vertical layering of resources and organisms in the Carboniferous forest is directly comparable to the vertical layering seen in modern tropical forests, where the canopy, understory, and forest floor each harbor distinct communities of organisms adapted to the specific light and nutrient conditions of their layer. The principle of resource partitioning along vertical gradients in forest ecosystems was established in the Carboniferous and has persisted as a fundamental organizing principle of forest ecology ever since. The dominant trees of the Carboniferous were not trees in the modern sense. The giant lycopsids, mainly of the genus Lepidodendron and its relatives, were plants reaching 30 or 40 meters tall with trunks up to 2 meters in diameter at the base. Their trunks were covered in bark with a pattern of rhombuses or diamonds that left the scars of fallen leaves, a pattern so characteristic that fossils of that bark are immediately recognizable in the geological record. The study of Carboniferous forests has also advanced significantly through the analysis of plant fossils using techniques borrowed from materials science. Synchrotron X-ray tomography, which allows three-dimensional reconstruction of fossil interiors without destructive sectioning, has revealed the internal anatomy of Carboniferous plant stems and roots in extraordinary detail. Those reconstructions show the arrangement of vascular bundles, the structure of reproductive tissues, and other anatomical details that allow direct comparison with living plant relatives. The result is an increasingly detailed understanding of how Carboniferous plants functioned physiologically, not just what they looked like externally. What makes those giant lycopsids especially strange is that their modern relatives are tiny. Modern club mosses, growing on the floors of humid forests worldwide, have stems just a few centimeters in diameter and heights of just a few centimeters. They are exactly the same type of plant, with the same reproductive strategy and the same basic architecture, but at a scale reduced by a factor of 1,000 or more. The Carboniferous giant lycopsids were possible because Carboniferous conditions, particularly the high oxygen level and the warm humid climate of the Pangea tropics, allowed them to grow to those scales. The tree-like horsetails, mainly of the genus Calamites, formed the second level of the Carboniferous forest. They could reach 20 meters in height, with trunks up to 30 centimeters in diameter, and produced branches articulated at the nodes of the stem, exactly like modern small horsetails but at an incomparably larger scale. The leaves of the tree-like horsetails, arranged in whorls at the nodes, created an appearance that was simultaneously familiar and completely strange. The ecology of the Carboniferous forest canopy also had different properties from modern tropical forests. The lycopsid giants had their branches and leaves concentrated at the top of the trunk, like modern palms, which meant the canopy was a relatively thin layer of vegetation at the crown of almost bare trunks, rather than the continuous multi-layer canopy of modern tropical forests. Light reached the Carboniferous forest floor differently as a result. The diversity of climbing forms, lianas that used the rough diamond bark of the lepidodendrons to ascend toward the light, added another vertical dimension to the forest. Those climbing forms, which clung to the bark with specialized attachment organs, meant the Carboniferous forest was a three-dimensional structure of considerable complexity, with organisms exploiting every vertical level of available space. The floor of the Carboniferous forest was a world in itself. Covered by a thick layer of plant debris in various states of decomposition, humid and dark beneath the closed canopy, it was the home of arthropods and of the first organisms that specialized in decomposing dead plant matter. The roots of the giant lycopsids, called rhizomorphs, spread horizontally near the surface of the swampy soil, unable to penetrate the anoxic sediment below, forming a network connecting the trees and stabilizing the muddy ground. The extremely high oxygen level of the Carboniferous had a consequence that is probably the most known and most visually striking of the entire period: the giant insects. The Meganeura, a Carboniferous dragonfly whose wingspan could reach 70 centimeters, is the most iconic animal of the period and one of the most well-known in the entire history of invertebrate paleontology. But the Meganeura was not the only giant. Carboniferous insects and other arthropods reached sizes with no equivalent in any subsequent period. The Carboniferous insect fauna also included the ancestors of some of the most important insect groups in modern ecosystems. The mayflies, whose aquatic larval stage and brief winged adult life make them an important indicator of water quality in modern rivers, were already present in the Carboniferous. Their aquatic larvae would have been important prey for the fish and small amphibians of Carboniferous streams and rivers. The stoneflies, another important modern aquatic insect group, also have Carboniferous or near Carboniferous origins. Those ancient associations between insects and freshwater habitats have persisted for 300 million years, a remarkable example of ecological stability across geological time. The studies of Meganeura's flight mechanics, conducted through computational models based on fossilized wings, suggest that giant dragonfly was a capable and efficient flyer despite its large size. Its flight anatomy, preserved in fossils, shows the same asynchronous flight mechanics that make modern dragonflies the best aerial hunters in the insect world. It could fly in any direction, including backward, and could stop its flight almost instantly to capture prey with its legs. In that sense, the Meganeura was essentially a giant-scaled modern dragonfly, using the same flight engineering as its miniaturized descendants. The Carboniferous insect record also includes some of the first evidence for mimicry and camouflage in animal evolution. Some Carboniferous insects show wing patterns that appear to mimic plant material, suggesting that the selective pressure of visually hunting predators, possibly the amphibians that could leave the water and hunt on the forest floor, was already driving the evolution of visual concealment strategies. The arms race between predators with good vision and prey that evolved to avoid detection is therefore at least as old as the Carboniferous, and possibly as old as the Devonian when vision first became an important predatory sense in vertebrates. The giant insects of the Carboniferous also raise interesting questions about predator-prey coevolution. If dragonflies the size of the Meganeura were hunting other insects, what were the other insects doing to avoid being caught? The fossil record of Carboniferous insects shows a variety of potential defensive adaptations. Some species had very rapid wing beats that might have made them more maneuverable, others had cryptic wing patterns that might have made them harder to spot, and still others were apparently heavily armored. That arms race between predatory and prey insects in the Carboniferous, played out over millions of years, would have driven both groups to increasingly refined capabilities. The fossil record of Carboniferous insects is uneven in its geographic coverage, with some regions of Europe and North America providing extraordinarily rich records while other parts of the world are much less known. The Commentary site in France, the Maison Creek site in Illinois, and several North American and European coal measure sites have provided most of what we know about Carboniferous insect diversity. Each new site discovered adds new species and sometimes entirely new groups to the picture, suggesting that the full diversity of Carboniferous insects is still far from completely known. The Arthropleura was a myriapod, a relative of modern centipedes and millipedes, that could reach 2.5 meters in length. It was the largest terrestrial arthropod that has ever existed in Earth's entire history. Its fossils, mainly in the form of tracks and exoskeleton fragments, are found in Carboniferous deposits of Europe and North America, and show a clearly millipede-like animal, a very elongated body composed of numerous segments, each with a pair of legs. It was probably herbivorous, feeding on the abundant vegetation of the Carboniferous forest floor. The most accepted explanation for Carboniferous insect gigantism remains the high atmospheric oxygen level. Insects breathe through a system of tubes called tracheae that carry air directly to the tissues without the mediation of a circulatory system for oxygen transport. That system works well for small insects, where the distances oxygen must travel by diffusion are short. But in large insects, oxygen must diffuse through longer tracheae, and the system's efficiency falls. The size limit of insects is determined in part by how much oxygen can diffuse effectively through that system. The paleoentomologists studying Carboniferous insects have identified in fossil-rich sites a complex predator-prey ecology among the insects themselves. The forms of predation observed in the mouthparts of Carboniferous insects suggest a diversity of hunting strategies: active predators pursuing prey, ambushers waiting motionless to surprise those passing, filter feeders collecting particles of organic matter from water. That ecological diversity among Carboniferous insects was comparable to what exists in modern insect communities. With 35% atmospheric oxygen instead of 21% today, oxygen could diffuse more deeply into insect tissues, allowing larger bodies. When oxygen levels fell at the end of the Carboniferous, the giant insects disappeared and maximum insect sizes were permanently reduced to the range we see in modern insects. It was not that giant insects lost competition with other animals. Simply, the world stopped allowing them to exist. The Meganeura and its relatives, the Meganeuran dragonflies, were the dominant aerial predators of the Carboniferous. Without birds, without bats, without any other vertebrate capable of flight, the only flying animals of the Carboniferous were the insects, and the Meganeurans were the largest and probably the most formidable of all. They hunted other insects in the air, with an efficiency that studies of their mouthparts suggest was comparable to that of modern dragonflies, which are extraordinarily efficient aerial hunters. The Carboniferous swamps were home to the dominant vertebrates of the period, and those vertebrates were amphibians. Not the amphibians we know today, the frogs and newts and salamanders, which are relatively small creatures with discrete lifestyles. Carboniferous amphibians were animals of a completely different scale, apex predators in their ecosystems, the functional equivalents of crocodiles in modern swamps. The transition from Carboniferous amphibian dominance to Permian amniote dominance was not a sudden replacement but a gradual shift driven by changing environmental conditions. In the early Carboniferous, amphibians were overwhelmingly dominant. In the late Carboniferous, amniotes were diversifying but still secondary. In the early Permian, both groups coexisted in ecosystems where amniotes were increasingly important. And by the mid-Permian, the large ecological niches were dominated by synapsid amniotes. The diversity of Carboniferous amphibians also helps us understand the ecological constraints that eventually made the amniote solution necessary. The largest Carboniferous amphibians were limited in how far they could range from water by their need to keep their skin moist for cutaneous respiration and by their need to return to water to reproduce. That geographic constraint effectively partitioned the Carboniferous world into an amphibian-dominated zone near water and an arthropod-dominated zone away from water. The amniotes, invading that arthropod-dominated zone with their water-independent reproduction, found a world rich in food resources and relatively empty of vertebrate competitors. They did not outcompete the amphibians for the swamp. They colonized the dry upland that the amphibians could not exploit. The physiological ecology of Carboniferous amphibians has also been illuminated by comparison with modern amphibians living in environments that partially mimic Carboniferous conditions. The giant salamanders of Eastern Asia, particularly the Chinese giant salamander, which can reach nearly 2 meters in length, give some sense of what large Carboniferous amphibians might have been like ecologically. Slow-moving ambush predators of aquatic environments, capable of going for extended periods without food, highly sensitive to water chemistry and temperature. The Chinese giant salamander is critically endangered today, a reminder of the vulnerability of large specialized predators to environmental change. The transition from water to land was not a single event but a continuum, and the Carboniferous represents the middle of that continuum for the vertebrate lineage. The Devonian had seen the first tetrapods venturing onto land while still fundamentally tied to water. The Carboniferous saw the establishment of a full amphibian fauna that had mastered terrestrial locomotion and feeding while still reproducing in water. The late Carboniferous and early Permian saw the final steps in that transition, with amniotes breaking the last tie to water through the evolution of the amniote egg. Understanding the Carboniferous amphibians is essential for understanding that transition, because they represent the fully developed intermediate stage between the first land-venturing fish and the fully terrestrial amniotes. The Carboniferous record of the transition in different geographic regions shows that it did not proceed at the same pace everywhere. In equatorial regions where permanent swamps persisted longest, amphibians remained important for longer. In higher latitude regions where the climate became seasonal earlier, amniotes gained the upper hand sooner. That geographic variation in the pace of the transition mirrors the geographic variation in climate change across Pangea during the late Carboniferous, confirming that the shift from amphibian to amniote dominance was driven fundamentally by the drying of the planet rather than by any inherent biological superiority of amniotes over amphibians. Archaeops is perhaps the best known of the large amphibians of the late Carboniferous and early Permian. It was an animal approximately 2 meters in length, with a robust low body, short but strong limbs, and a large flat head with an enormous mouth full of sharp teeth. Its posture was more similar to a crocodile than a modern frog, laterally projecting limbs supporting the body close to the ground, allowing movement both in water and on land. The Carboniferous amphibians also interacted with each other in complex ways that the fossil record hints at. Some large temnospondylls show bite marks on their bones from other large temnospondylls, suggesting cannibalism or at least aggressive competition between individuals of the same species. That kind of intraspecific competition is common in modern crocodilians and large predatory fish, and its presence in Carboniferous amphibians suggests that the social and competitive behaviors we associate with large modern predators have deep evolutionary roots. The Carboniferous was not simply a world of simple, instinct-driven organisms. It was a world of animals with behavioral complexity shaped by millions of years of selection on social and competitive interactions. The Archaeops were generalist predators hunting both in water and on swamp banks. In water, they were probably ambushers waiting motionless until prey approached close enough to be caught with a rapid head movement. On land, they could move actively in search of prey, though their speed and agility on land were limited by the lateral posture of their limbs. The Carboniferous amphibian diversity went well beyond the large aquatic predators. Microsaurs were a group of small lizard-like amphibians living in the Carboniferous forest floor, hunting insects and other invertebrates in the leaf litter. They had elongated bodies, relatively long legs for amphibians, and in some cases scales on the skin that reduced water loss, an adaptation showing the beginning of the process that would eventually lead to waterproof amniotes. The dominance of amphibians in the Carboniferous had a fundamental limitation that would ultimately prove their undoing. They needed water to reproduce. Amphibians lay their eggs in water, where embryos develop protected by moisture. Without water, the eggs would desiccate before embryos could develop. That meant amphibians, despite being able to move on land and exploit terrestrial resources, could never stray too far from water bodies. They were prisoners of the aquatic and semi-aquatic ecosystems. That limitation was especially critical in the Carboniferous context, where the densest vegetation and most abundant food resources were not necessarily next to water but in the forest interior, sometimes at considerable distances from swamps and rivers. Amphibians could exploit those resources during terrestrial excursions, but had to return. The evolutionary solution to that problem was already developing in the Carboniferous, the invention of the amniote egg by the first reptiles. At some point in the Carboniferous, approximately 320 million years ago, an animal externally very similar to its amphibian cousins laid a different egg. An egg with internal membranes creating a watery environment around the embryo even though the egg was on dry land. An egg that could be deposited away from water and that protected the embryo from desiccation. The invention of the amniote egg also had consequences for the evolutionary trajectory of embryonic development that reach all the way to modern developmental biology. The constraints of development inside a closed egg, where waste cannot be excreted to the outside, led to the evolution of systems for managing waste that are the ancestors of the systems we use today. The allantois, the membrane managing respiratory gases and waste in the amniote egg, became in mammals the placenta. The amnion, the membrane creating the protective fluid sac, gave its name to the entire group of amniotes and is still present in human pregnancies. The amniote lineage that eventually produced the mammals, the synapsids, and the lineage that produced the reptiles and birds diverged early in the history of the amniotes, perhaps before the end of the Carboniferous itself. That early divergence is visible in subtle differences in the skull anatomy of the earliest amniotes. Synapsids have a single temporal opening on each side of the skull. Reptiles have different arrangements depending on the subgroup. Those skull differences reflect different arrangements of the jaw muscles, which in turn reflect different feeding strategies and metabolic demands. The synapsid skull arrangement, with its single temporal opening accommodating large jaw muscles, was already in the Carboniferous beginning the journey toward the complex mammalian masticatory apparatus. The biochemistry of the amniote egg also illustrates a broader principle about evolutionary innovation, that major innovations often solve multiple problems simultaneously. The amniote egg did not just solve the problem of desiccation. It also solved the problem of embryonic waste management through the allantoic system. It solved the problem of gas exchange for the embryo in an enclosed space, through the chorioallantoic membrane permeable to oxygen and carbon dioxide. It solved the problem of mechanical protection for the embryo through the shell. Each of those problems had to be solved simultaneously for the amniote egg to work at all, suggesting that the evolution of the amniote egg involved multiple simultaneous changes, a reminder that major evolutionary transitions often require coordinated changes across multiple biological systems. Understanding the evolutionary origin of those developmental structures in the Carboniferous amniote egg helps explain aspects of human embryology that would otherwise seem arbitrary. Why does the human embryo develop inside a fluid-filled sac? Because the first amniote eggs created that sac 320 million years ago, and evolution has conserved that mechanism through the entire subsequent history of the amniote lineage. The connection between Carboniferous evolutionary innovation and human developmental biology is direct and unbroken. That animal was the first amniote. And that egg, the amniote egg, was one of the most important evolutionary inventions in vertebrate history. The evolution of internal fertilization in amniotes, a necessary prerequisite for the amniote egg, also had long-term consequences for the evolution of male reproductive anatomy and behavior. In amphibians, fertilization is typically external. Males and females release sperm and eggs into the water simultaneously. Internal fertilization requires behavioral coordination between male and female, anatomical structures for sperm transfer, and in many cases complex courtship rituals that allow females to assess male quality before allowing fertilization. Those behavioral and anatomical systems, first evolving in the Carboniferous amniotes, set in motion an evolutionary dynamic of sexual selection that has been one of the most productive sources of biological diversity throughout vertebrate history. Amniotes are the group including all reptiles, birds, and mammals. Modern reptiles like lizards and snakes, crocodilians, turtles, are amniotes. Birds are amniotes. Mammals, including humans, are amniotes. We all share that same type of egg, or in the case of mammals, the same fetal membranes that are the internal version of that egg. The amniote egg appeared in the Carboniferous, and without it terrestrial vertebrates could never have colonized all terrestrial habitats of the planet. The amniote egg also solved a problem that amphibians never resolved, that of dissolving metabolic waste products. Amphibian embryos excrete their nitrogenous waste directly into the surrounding water. Amniote embryos, enclosed in an impermeable egg, cannot excrete to the outside. The allantoic system, the membrane in the amniote egg that manages respiratory gases and waste, stores nitrogenous waste as uric acid, a relatively insoluble compound that can be stored in the egg without harming the embryo. That solution to the excretion problem in the sealed egg was one of the preconditions for the amniote egg to be viable. The first Carboniferous amniotes were small, mostly insectivorous, and externally not very different from other primitive amniotes of their era. Hylonomus of Nova Scotia, one of the most primitive known amniotes, was an animal approximately 30 centimeters in length that lived in Carboniferous forests of what is now Canada. Its fossils were found inside the hollow trunks of giant lycopsids, where it probably hunted the small invertebrates living in the forest floor leaf litter. The differentiation of teeth into types with distinct functions, incisors for cutting, canines for capturing and tearing, molars for grinding, also began in Carboniferous synapsids and continued developing through the Permian and Triassic until culminating in the highly differentiated dentition of modern mammals. That dental differentiation has enormous consequences for the biology of the animals that developed it. Specialized teeth allow processing foods in ways that uniform teeth cannot. Molars grinding vegetation allow extracting more nutrients from difficult-to-digest plants. The diversification of amniotes from the Carboniferous onward was one of the most important evolutionary processes in vertebrate history. From the primitive amniote trunk arose two great lineages: the synapsids, which eventually produced mammals, and the reptiles in the broad sense, which produced turtles, lizards, snakes, crocodilians, dinosaurs, and birds. All that extraordinary diversity of terrestrial vertebrates has its root in that first Carboniferous amniote that laid the first egg capable of surviving on dry land. The Carboniferous swamp, the ecosystem existing in the tropics of Pangea during the period we are exploring, was one of the most productive and richest environments in Earth's history. Not rich in terms of species diversity, which was less than that of modern tropical ecosystems, but rich in terms of biomass, of the total amount of living matter per unit area. The Carboniferous swamp also had a distinctive chemical environment that shaped the evolution of the organisms living in it. The dark tannin-stained water of many Carboniferous swamps, produced by the leaching of plant compounds from the abundant organic matter in the water, created conditions of low pH and low nutrient availability similar to modern blackwater rivers of the Amazon and Congo. Organisms living in those waters had to tolerate those chemical conditions, and the evolutionary adaptations to low pH, low nutrient environments that we see in modern blackwater river species may have their origins partly in the Carboniferous swamp environments. The Carboniferous swamp ecosystem also had an unusual relationship to fire that shaped its long-term dynamics in ways we are still trying to fully understand. The high oxygen atmosphere meant that fires were not rare catastrophes as they might be in a modern ecosystem, but relatively frequent events that occurred whenever lightning struck dry organic material. That frequency of fire meant that the Carboniferous forest was adapted to fire in ways that modern forests, which experience much lower fire frequencies, are not. The lycopsids may have been fire-adapted plants, with thick spore-bearing structures resistant to brief fires, and the post-fire regeneration of the forest may have been dominated by the same lycopsids that had seeded the area before the fire. Understanding Carboniferous fire ecology is an active research area with implications for understanding how modern forests will respond to the increasing fire frequencies being produced by climate change. The Carboniferous swamp also provided the environment for some of the earliest known examples of parental care in terrestrial vertebrates. Some Carboniferous amphibian fossil sites preserve multiple individuals of the same species of different sizes in close association, which some paleontologists interpret as evidence of family groups or parental attendance at nesting sites. That interpretation is speculative, but the ecological logic supporting it is sound. In a world where eggs or young are vulnerable to predation by the many arthropods and other vertebrates of the swamp, parental protection would have been selectively advantageous. If correct, the earliest stirrings of vertebrate parental care have their origins in the Carboniferous swamp ecosystem. The abundant organic matter in the Carboniferous swamp water also created zones of very low oxygen at depth, because the decomposition of that organic matter consumed oxygen rapidly. That stratification of oxygenated surface water over anoxic deep water in the Carboniferous swamps is similar to the stratification seen in modern eutrophic lakes and swamps, and created similar ecological challenges for the organisms inhabiting those water bodies. Organisms that could tolerate low oxygen, like the lungfish breathing air directly at the surface, had a significant advantage in those conditions. The giant lycopsids grew rapidly and produced enormous quantities of organic matter. Leaves, spores, trunks, roots. That organic matter, falling into the swamp water, was the base of a food chain supporting from the smallest organisms to the large apex predator amphibians. The swamp was in that sense an extraordinarily efficient machine for converting solar energy into animal biomass. The Carboniferous swamp forests, while dominated by the lycopsids and horsetails already described, also hosted a variety of smaller plant forms that are less frequently mentioned but ecologically important. The cordatales were a group of tall trees with long strap-like leaves that grew in slightly drier areas at the margins of the main swamps. They were among the ancestors of the conifers that would become dominant in the Permian and Mesozoic. The cordatalian pollen preserved in Carboniferous sediments often shows distribution patterns suggesting long-distance wind dispersal, consistent with a plant living in more open, less humid habitats where wind exposure was greater than in the swamp interior. The hydrological dynamics of the Carboniferous swamp were also different from those of modern swamps. The water level varied with seasons and with longer climate cycles, and those periodic variations created transitional zones between the permanently aquatic and permanently terrestrial environments. Those transitional zones were especially productive and especially inhabited. It was at the swamp margins where amphibians could access both aquatic and terrestrial resources, where adult insects that had completed their aquatic larval phase gathered to mate, where plants produced their reproductive structures. The Mason Creek type of preservation, where iron concretions in coal deposits preserve animals and plants in three-dimensional detail, including soft tissues, represents one of the most extraordinary fossil records in the world and has revealed aspects of Carboniferous swamp ecology that would otherwise be completely unknown. The Mason Creek specimens from Illinois include jellyfish, worms, complete insects, plants, amphibians, and fish, all preserved in a quality allowing study of their biology at a level of detail impossible in most fossil sites. Those specimens have revealed that the Carboniferous swamp ecosystem was far more complex and more diverse than the large bones and bark impressions visible in coal would suggest. The sound of the Carboniferous swamp would also be completely different from that of any modern swamp. Without birds, without frogs croaking at the water's edge, without mammals, the sounds would be mainly those of insects. The hum of giant dragonflies, the crackling of insects walking on leaf litter, possibly the sound of wind in lycopsid leaves. A sound world without birdsong, without the croaking of modern amphibians, strange to any human ear. The Carboniferous seas were as extraordinary as their forests, though less known to the general public. The Carboniferous was a period of great marine richness, with reefs of rugose corals and bryozoans extending along the continental shelves of Pangea, and with a vertebrate marine fauna dominated by groups now extinct or surviving only as shadows of what they were. The marine ecosystems of the Carboniferous also hosted some of the most remarkable examples of convergent evolution in the fossil record. Convergent evolution, the independent evolution of similar features in unrelated organisms facing similar ecological challenges, produced in Carboniferous seas body forms that would appear again millions of years later in completely different organisms. The Carboniferous marine world also preserved one of the most detailed records of predation in the Paleozoic fossil record. Coprolites, fossilized feces, from Carboniferous marine deposits often contain identifiable fragments of the prey organisms that were digested, providing direct evidence of what was eating what in those ancient seas. Large Carboniferous shark coprolites contain fragments of crinoids, indicating that at least some sharks were feeding on the crinoid meadows. Other coprolites contain fish bones, shell fragments, and other identifiable materials that build a picture of the marine food web that no amount of skeletal fossil analysis alone could provide. Those coprolite studies are one of the least glamorous but most informationally rich approaches to understanding Carboniferous ecology. The Carboniferous seas were also the site of important evolutionary experiments in reef building that prefigure the modern coral reef. The Carboniferous reefs were not dominated by the scleractinian corals that build modern reefs, which did not yet exist, but by rugose corals, bryozoans, and various types of calcareous algae that collectively created reef structures of considerable complexity. The ecological interactions within those ancient reefs, between the reef builders and the organisms living among and within their structures, paralleled many of the interactions visible in modern coral reefs, demonstrating that the reef ecological system, though built from different organisms in different geological periods, is a robust and repeatedly successful solution to the challenge of building a complex community in shallow tropical seas. The Carboniferous seas were also one of the settings for the evolution of increasingly sophisticated predator-prey interactions among vertebrates. The escalating arms race between predators and prey, with prey evolving better defenses and predators evolving better abilities to overcome those defenses, drove the evolution of ever more sophisticated sensory systems, locomotor abilities, and behavioral strategies in both groups. The large eyes and lateral line systems of Carboniferous fish, the complex swim bladder systems allowing precise depth control, and the beginnings of schooling behavior as a predator avoidance strategy, all reflect the intensifying selection pressures of that predator-prey arms race. The flattened body form with large pectoral fins we associate with modern rays evolved independently in several groups of Carboniferous sharks and fish, presumably as an adaptation for feeding on bottom-dwelling organisms. The elongated sinuous body form we associate with eels evolved independently in several groups of Carboniferous fish and marine invertebrates, presumably as an adaptation for moving through dense vegetation or rocky crevices. That repeated convergent evolution of similar body forms in response to similar ecological challenges demonstrates that the range of effective solutions to common ecological problems is limited, and that natural selection reliably finds those solutions when the problem is presented repeatedly. Carboniferous sharks were one of the most remarkable groups of the period's seas. Far from being the gray sharks we know today, Carboniferous sharks presented a morphological diversity with no equivalent in any subsequent period. The Stethocanthus had on its dorsal fin a strange structure that has been compared to an ironing board or an anvil, covered with small denticles similar to those on the body surface. The function of that structure is still debated by researchers. The Carboniferous marine food webs were also shaped by the absence of groups that would later become ecologically important. Modern marine ecosystems are dominated by teleost fish, the group including most familiar bony fish. Teleosts were minor elements in Carboniferous seas, not yet the dominant marine vertebrates they would become after the Permian-Triassic extinction cleared the way for their diversification. The dominant marine vertebrates of the Carboniferous were sharks and their relatives, along with older lineages of bony fish. That difference in the composition of the apex vertebrate predator guild would have cascading effects on the structure of the marine food web, shaping which prey organisms were most abundant and which ecological niches were most effectively filled. The helicoprion is another of the most extraordinary sharks of the Carboniferous and Permian, known mainly for its most striking element, a spiral of teeth that grew continuously throughout the animal's life. Instead of losing teeth as they wore down like modern sharks, the helicoprion retained them in a spiral that gradually lengthened inward into the mouth. The older teeth were displaced toward the inner spiral while new ones formed on the outer edge. The result was a tooth spiral structure that can measure up to 40 centimeters in diameter in the largest specimens. The crinoids, with their elegant sea lily forms, formed meadows on Carboniferous sea floors that must have been of extraordinary beauty. Their fossils are extremely abundant in Carboniferous limestones worldwide, and in some sites the discs and stalks of crinoids form virtually all the rock, documenting the extraordinary abundance of those organisms in the period seas. The blastoids, extinct relatives of sea urchins and starfish, were also part of the Carboniferous reef communities. With their bodies in flower bud form mounted on a stalk like crinoids, blastoids were one of the most successful echinoderm groups of the Paleozoic before their extinction in the Permian-Triassic mass extinction. The ammonites of the Carboniferous, the cephalopods with coiled spiral shells that would be so abundant in Mesozoic seas, were already present and diversifying. Carboniferous forms were mostly of relatively simple shell, without the elaborate ornamentations characterizing Jurassic and Cretaceous forms, but already showing the diversity of forms and sizes that would make that group one of the richest in the geological record. The climate of the Carboniferous was not uniform throughout the period nor uniform geographically. The Carboniferous was a period of important climatic variations, including a significant glaciation in the southern hemisphere that had consequences for life distribution and ecosystem dynamics throughout the planet. The Milankovitch cycles recorded in the Carboniferous cyclothems provide one of the oldest and most detailed records of orbital forcing of Earth's climate. That record is particularly valuable because it comes from a time when the Earth's orbital parameters may have been somewhat different from today's, providing data for testing the mathematical models of orbital dynamics that are used to predict both past and future climate variability. The Carboniferous glacial cycles also had consequences for biodiversity in ways that are still being studied. The repeated alternation between swamp-covered and drier tropical environments, driven by the glacial cycles, may have driven pulses of speciation in the isolated forest patches that survived during dry periods and then come back into contact with each other during humid periods. That alternation of isolation and reconnection, similar in principle to the glacial refugia model used to explain Pleistocene biodiversity patterns, would have produced a Carboniferous biosphere with complex biogeographic patterns reflecting a history of fragmentation and reconnection. Testing that model requires more detailed analysis of the geographic distribution of Carboniferous species than is currently available from the fossil record. The cyclothem record also provides direct evidence of how quickly the climate system can respond to orbital forcing. The transitions between glacial and interglacial conditions recorded in the cyclothems occurred over timescales of thousands of years, similar to the timescales of Pleistocene glacial cycles. That similarity suggests that the fundamental dynamics of the climate system's response to orbital forcing have been relatively constant over hundreds of millions of years, even as the specific organisms and geographic configurations have changed dramatically. The tropics of the Carboniferous, where the great swampy forests of giant lycopsids developed, were warm and humid for most of the period. Temperatures were probably similar to or slightly higher than those of modern tropics, and humidity was extreme due to the combination of high temperatures and dense vegetation transpiring enormous quantities of water. That persistent tropical climate was what allowed the maintenance of the swampy forests for millions of years. The transition from Carboniferous to Permian climate was also accompanied by significant changes in ocean chemistry. The falling sea levels of the late Carboniferous, as water was locked up in the expanding Gondwanan ice sheets, exposed continental shelves and reduced the area of shallow marine habitat. That reduction in shallow marine area had effects on the marine carbon cycle, as the shallow seas are disproportionately important for carbonate precipitation and organic carbon burial compared to the deep ocean. Those changes in marine carbon cycling interacted with the changes in terrestrial carbon cycling already described, creating a complex multi-system perturbation that makes the late Carboniferous one of the most studied intervals in the history of Earth system science. The Gondwana glaciation of the Carboniferous is one of the period's most important aspects for understanding global climate dynamics. Gondwana, the southern hemisphere supercontinent including what are today South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica, was in the Carboniferous over the South Pole. That polar position produced a glaciation that at its most intense covered large extensions of the supercontinent with ice sheets. The cyclothems of the late Carboniferous, those cyclic sequences of marine and terrestrial sediments repeating regularly in Carboniferous rocks of eastern North America and Europe, were recognized by 19th-century geologists as cyclic structures before any theory existed to explain them. The explanation arrived with the Milankovitch cycle theory in the 20th century. The Milankovitch cycles are periodic variations in Earth's orbit and rotation axis producing variations in solar radiation received by the planet, especially at high latitudes where glaciers can grow or retreat. In the Carboniferous, Milankovitch cycles also operated, and with Gondwana glaciers as an active component of the climate system, those cycles produced global sea level variations that left their mark in the cyclothems. Each cyclothem records a complete Milankovitch cycle: glacial advance that lowered sea level, exposed shelves, and allowed forest growth in low coastal zones, then glacial retreat that raised sea level, flooded coastal zones, and covered the forests with marine sediments. That interpretation of cyclothems, completely counterintuitive when first proposed in the 1980s, is today widely accepted and provides one of the most detailed records of Carboniferous glacial cycles. Coal is, in many ways, the most visible and most impactful legacy of the Carboniferous in the modern world. The coal deposits exploited today in Europe, North America, China, India, and other parts of the world are mostly the organic matter of Carboniferous forests that was buried, compressed, and transformed over 300 million years until becoming the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution and that remains one of the world's most important energy sources. The Industrial Revolution powered by Carboniferous coal also had environmental consequences that connect directly to the ecology of the Carboniferous itself. The burning of coal releases not only carbon dioxide but also sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. The acid rain produced by those emissions damaged forests across Europe and North America during the 20th century, reducing the productivity of exactly the type of forest ecosystems whose ancient predecessors produced the coal being burned. There is a dark irony in that. The Carboniferous forests whose buried remains we were burning were themselves being damaged by the emissions from that burning. The geography of global coal deposits also serves as indirect evidence for the reconstruction of past continental configurations. When geologists in the 19th century began mapping coal distribution and comparing plant fossils in those deposits, they found similarities between coal-bearing strata on different continents that could not be explained if the continents had always been in their current positions. Those similarities, combined with other geological and paleontological evidence, were among the first pieces of evidence that led to the development of the theory of continental drift and eventually to the modern theory of plate tectonics. The question of when the fungi that could efficiently decompose lignin evolved is one of the most fascinating problems in Carboniferous biology, because the answer determines when the great carbon burial of the Carboniferous ended and when the modern decomposition cycle was established. The current best estimate, based on molecular clock analyses of fungal evolution, suggests that the white rot fungi with the most efficient lignin-degrading enzyme systems evolved near the Permian-Triassic boundary or early Triassic, approximately coinciding with the end of the major coal-forming period. That temporal correlation is suggestive but not conclusive, and the actual evolutionary history of fungal lignin degradation is more complex and more gradual than a simple before and after story would suggest. The coal itself, as a rock, has physical properties that reflect its biological origins. The banding visible in many coal samples, alternating layers of bright and dull material, reflects alternating layers of different types of plant material. Bright coal corresponding to the waxy outer coatings of plant spores, dull coal corresponding to the woody material of stems and roots. Those bands are a structural memory of the Carboniferous forest encoded in the rock, readable by a trained eye as a record of the plants that contributed to the coal, their relative abundance, and the seasonal or longer-term cycles of deposition. The Carboniferous coal thus contributed not only to the Industrial Revolution but also to one of the most fundamental scientific revolutions in the understanding of how our planet works. The fossils preserved in coal mines, the patterns of coal distribution across continents, the geochemical signatures of Carboniferous organic matter, all played roles in developing our current understanding of Earth's history that extend far beyond the specific geological period they record. The process of coal formation began when the trunks and branches of giant lycopsids and seed ferns fell into the swamp water. In low-oxygen conditions preventing normal aerobic decomposition, that would slowly transform into peat, a mass of semi-decomposed organic matter. Peat, subjected to the pressure of accumulating sediments above, lost water and compacted, becoming first lignite, then bituminous coal, and under the most extreme pressure and temperature conditions, anthracite. In many Carboniferous sites in Europe and North America, it is possible to find in coal seams perfectly preserved fossils of the vegetation that formed that coal. Lycopsid leaves with their characteristic scar pattern, fragments of lepidodendron bark with its diamond pattern, tree horsetail trunks with their articulated structure. Those fossils in the coal are like a photograph of the forests that existed, frozen in time at the moment they died and began their transformation into fuel. The development of radiometric dating techniques in the 20th century allowed for the first time establishing absolute chronologies for geological periods, including the Carboniferous. Before those techniques, geologists could order strata relatively, saying one was older than another, but could not assign them ages in years. With radiometric dating, using the decay of isotopes of uranium, rubidium, potassium, and other elements, it became possible to establish that the Carboniferous began 359 million years ago and ended 299 million years ago, with a precision of some hundreds of thousands of years. Coal mining also contributed to scientific knowledge of the Carboniferous in unplanned ways. Excavations to access coal seems exposed fossils that would otherwise have remained inaccessible below the surface. Natural history museums of Europe and North America accumulated from the 19th century onward enormous collections of Carboniferous fossils extracted from coal mines, and those collections remain the basis of much of what we know about Carboniferous life. The coal of the Carboniferous thus gave us not only the energy to industrialize but also much of the evidence for understanding the world that produced that coal. The ecology of the Carboniferous was a complex system of relationships between organisms that in many respects has no equivalent in the modern world. The food chains, the competitive and symbiotic relationships, the nutrient cycles, all of that functioned in the Carboniferous according to the same ecological principles working today, but with a completely different cast of characters. The nutrient cycling in the Carboniferous also illustrates an important principle about ecosystem stability and resilience. Modern forest ecosystems are characterized by tight nutrient cycling, where the nutrients in dead organisms and organic matter are rapidly returned to the soil and made available for new plant growth. That tight cycling makes modern forests highly productive despite often growing on nutrient-poor soils, because the nutrients are recycled efficiently rather than being lost. The nutrient web of the Carboniferous also included an important element that is rarely discussed, the microbiome of the large herbivorous animals that evolved in the late Carboniferous and early Permian. The first large vertebrate herbivores, including the diadectomorphs mentioned earlier and later the dicynodonts of the Permian, faced the challenge of digesting plant material that was both chemically complex and mechanically tough. Modern herbivores solve that challenge partly through specialized gut microbiomes that contain microbial species capable of fermenting plant cell walls. The evolution of those gut microbiomes in the first large herbivorous vertebrates was a coevolutionary process linking the evolution of the plant eaters to the evolution of the gut microbes, a relationship that continues in modern ruminants and other herbivores today. The relationship between the Carboniferous forest ecosystem and the modern forest ecosystems that evolved from it is one of deep homology in ecological function but radical discontinuity in the specific organisms performing those functions. Modern forest fungi decompose lignin efficiently using enzymes that their Carboniferous predecessors lacked. Modern earthworms aerate soil that Carboniferous invertebrates could not access in the same way. Modern birds consume insects that Carboniferous flying predators could not pursue into the tree canopy in the same manner. Each functional role in the modern forest ecosystem is performed by different organisms from those performing the same role in the Carboniferous, yet the functional structure of the ecosystem, the relationships between producers, consumers, and decomposers, remains recognizably similar. The Carboniferous forest, with its incomplete wood decomposition and its tendency to bury rather than recycle carbon, had a less tight nutrient cycle in some respects. That loose coupling between production and decomposition was ultimately a geological phenomenon of global significance, as it was what produced the coal deposits. But it also meant that the Carboniferous forest ecosystem was in some sense continuously mining the geological substrate for nutrients rather than recycling them efficiently, a strategy that was only possible given the specific conditions of the Carboniferous that made that substrate nutrient-rich enough to sustain. At the base of the terrestrial food chain were the primary producers, the plants converting solar energy into biomass. The lycopsids, horsetails, seed ferns were the dominant producers of the Carboniferous terrestrial ecosystem. Their biomass production rate was enormous, powered by the warm humid climate of the Pangea tropics and by the high atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration of the period, which facilitated photosynthesis. The Carboniferous was also the period when the basic body plans of most terrestrial invertebrate groups were fully established. The basic millipede body plan, the basic centipede body plan, the basic spider body plan, the basic scorpion body plan. All were present in the Carboniferous in forms recognizably similar to their modern representatives. That early stabilization of invertebrate body plans is one of the most striking features of animal evolutionary history. The great diversity of body plans appeared in the Cambrian and early Paleozoic, and once established, those plans proved remarkably durable. The 300 million years since the Carboniferous have produced enormous diversity of species within those body plans, but have not produced fundamentally new body plans comparable to those that appeared in the early Paleozoic. The first consumers of that plant biomass were the arthropods. The Arthropleura and its relatives probably ate dead and semi-decomposed plant matter on the forest floor. Other arthropods specialized in piercing plant stems to access the nutrient-rich vascular tissues. Herbivorous insects were already diversifying in the Carboniferous, beginning the long coevolutionary history between plants and insects that would eventually give rise to the extraordinary relationships between flowers and pollinators of the Cretaceous. The complexity of Carboniferous food chains also included some interactions that surprise when discovered in the fossil record. Finding the remains of small amniotes in the fossilized stomach contents of some Carboniferous amphibians indicates that the large amphibians ate the first reptiles. In Carboniferous ecosystems, amniotes were prey of the amphibians that they would eventually displace. That inverted predator-prey relationship, where the group that would ultimately become dominant in later periods was prey of the group that would ultimately become marginal, is one of the most interesting patterns emerging from the study of evolutionary transitions in the fossil record. The mycorrhizal fungi on Carboniferous plant roots, whose fossils have been found in the roots of lycopsids and seed ferns, helped those plants absorb nutrients from the soil, especially phosphorus that was a limiting nutrient in the poor soils of Carboniferous swamps. Those invisible fungal networks were the foundation on which all the visible productivity of the Carboniferous forest ecosystem rested, an ancient partnership between plants and fungi that persists unchanged in principle in every modern forest. In the Carboniferous ecosystems, discrete and small compared to the large amphibians dominating the period, lived the organisms that would eventually change the world, the first synapsids. Synapsids are the group of amniotes that would eventually produce mammals, and in the Carboniferous they were just beginning their evolutionary history. The late Carboniferous synapsids were not merely the precursors of mammals. They were also important components of the ecosystems in which they lived, playing ecological roles that had consequences for the evolution of other organisms sharing those ecosystems. As synapsid herbivores became more efficient at processing plant material, they created new selection pressures on the plants they ate, driving the evolution of plant defenses and the diversification of plant reproductive strategies. As synapsid predators became more active and more pursuit-oriented, they created new selection pressures on their prey, driving the evolution of faster locomotion and more active anti-predator behaviors in the organisms they hunted. The early synapsids of the Carboniferous were already showing the beginnings of what would become one of the most distinctive features of the mammalian lineage: parental investment in offspring. While the evidence for behavior in extinct organisms is always indirect, the relatively large egg sizes inferred for some early synapsids, combined with bone microstructure evidence for rapid early growth, suggest that these animals were already investing more energy per offspring than many contemporaneous reptiles. That trend toward higher investment per offspring and fewer offspring, characteristic of modern mammals compared to most modern reptiles, appears to have begun early in synapsid history, possibly even in the Carboniferous. The question of when exactly the mammalian lineage diverged from the reptilian lineage within the amniotes has been refined considerably by modern molecular phylogenetics and improved fossil calibration. The current best estimates place that divergence in the Carboniferous, approximately 312 million years ago, based on a combination of fossil evidence and molecular clock analyses. That date, like all divergence date estimates for deep evolutionary events, carries significant uncertainty, but it places the origin of both major amniote lineages firmly within the Carboniferous period we have been exploring tonight. The paleontology of the Carboniferous has also been advanced in recent years by the application of computed tomography, CT scanning, to fossil specimens. CT scanning allows the internal structure of fossils to be imaged without destroying the specimens, revealing anatomical details that were previously only accessible through destructive preparation. Applied to small Carboniferous amniote skulls, CT scanning has revealed the detailed internal anatomy of the brain case, the structure of the middle ear, and the arrangement of teeth roots, providing data that was previously impossible to obtain from these rare and valuable specimens. Those new data have in some cases significantly revised the phylogenetic position of key early amniote taxa, changing our understanding of the sequence of evolutionary changes leading from the first amniotes to the modern reptile, bird, and mammal lineages. Those coevolutionary interactions between the synapsids and the other organisms of their ecosystems were an important driver of the rapid evolutionary changes seen in multiple lineages during the late Carboniferous and the Permian. The synapsids were not passively diversifying in a static world. They were actively reshaping the world they inhabited through their ecological interactions, and that reshaped world was in turn driving their own further evolution. The first Carboniferous synapsids were small, insectivorous, and externally not very different from other primitive amniotes of their era. The characteristic distinguishing them, and that has led paleontologists to classify them in their own group, is the presence of a single opening on each side of the skull behind the eye socket, called the temporal fenestra. That opening is not simply a hole in the skull. It is the space where the muscles closing the jaw inserted, and its presence indicates those muscles were more voluminous and more complex than those of primitive reptiles, suggesting greater chewing efficiency and possibly a more active metabolism. The early synapsids of the Carboniferous were already beginning to differentiate ecologically in ways that would prove important for the subsequent history of the group. Some were primarily insectivorous, hunting the abundant insects of the Carboniferous forest floor. Others were omnivorous, exploiting a wider range of food resources. Still others were beginning to experiment with diets including plant material, though the fully developed herbivory of later synapsids was not yet present in the Carboniferous forms. That ecological diversification, from a common small insectivorous ancestor to a range of dietary specialists, is a pattern that would repeat many times in the subsequent evolution of the synapsid lineage, each major clade diversifying from a less specialized ancestor into a range of ecological specialists. The Dimetrodon, the most famous of the sail-backed pelycosaur synapsids of the early Permian descended from Carboniferous ancestors, had over its back a structure of extended dorsal vertebrae covered in skin that could act as a temperature regulator, absorbing sun heat to warm the body quickly in the morning or dissipating excess heat during the hottest times of day. The function of the sail has been debated by paleontologists for more than a century, with hypotheses including thermoregulation, visual signaling for species recognition or mate attraction, and intimidation of competitors. The history of synapsids from their humble Carboniferous origins to their eventual diversification into Permian therapsids and Mesozoic mammals is one of the longest and richest evolutionary stories in the fossil record. Some analyses of bone microstructure of the earliest synapsids show growth patterns that in modern mammals are associated with the elevated metabolism of warm-blooded animals. If that correlation is correct, the late Carboniferous synapsids were already on the path toward the type of metabolism distinguishing mammals from reptiles, though still far from achieving the precise temperature control of modern mammals. In the Carboniferous, those first synapsids were just one of many amniote groups diversifying, with nothing in their anatomy indicating they would be the group whose evolutionary line would eventually give rise to the humans who are tonight listening to their story. The diversity of primitive amniotes in the Carboniferous was considerable, and paleontologists continue debating the phylogenetic relationships among the various groups. In the forests and swamps of the Carboniferous lived together primitive synapsids, true primitive reptiles, and intermediate forms difficult to definitively classify in either group. The Carboniferous fossil record in North America is particularly well documented in the coal-bearing formations of the eastern United States, the Illinois Basin, and the Appalachian region. Those formations have been extensively mined for coal since the 19th century, and the mining operations have exposed enormous quantities of fossil material that has been collected and studied by generations of paleontologists. The Joggins site in Nova Scotia, where the first amniote fossils were described, is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing its exceptional paleontological value. The site exposes a continuous vertical succession of Carboniferous sediments in the sea cliffs, with upright lycopsid stumps visible at multiple levels, documenting the repeated subsidence and burial of forest that characterized the area during the Carboniferous. Visiting Joggins is one of the most direct ways to connect with the Carboniferous world. You can touch the rock that contains the first amniote fossils, see the outline of lycopsid bark patterns in the cliff face, and understand viscerally how those ancient forests were buried and preserved over millions of years. It is a place where geological deep time becomes physically present. The fossil record of the Carboniferous also includes some remarkable examples of behavioral preservation. In addition to the small reptiles and amphibians found inside the hollow lycopsid trunks at Joggins, which demonstrates something about the ecological use of those tree trunks as shelters, some Carboniferous fossil sites preserve evidence of feeding behavior, mating behavior, and territorial behavior preserved in the arrangement of fossils or in feeding traces on plant and animal material. Those behavioral fossils are especially valuable because behavior is normally invisible in the fossil record. We know the shapes of Carboniferous organisms from their skeletons. We know what they ate from their gut contents and feeding traces. But knowing how they behaved socially, how they found mates, how they competed with rivals, requires especially favorable preservation conditions that are rare. The Carboniferous sites that provide those glimpses of behavior are among the most scientifically precious fossil localities in the world. The American Carboniferous record complements the European record in important ways. European sites, particularly those in England, Belgium, France, and Germany, provide rich records of marine invertebrates and plant fossils. American sites, particularly Mason Creek in Illinois and the coal measures of Pennsylvania and Ohio, provide extraordinarily rich records of soft-bodied organisms and insects that are rarely preserved elsewhere. Together, those complementary records from different parts of what was once the tropical swamp belt of Pangea provide a more complete picture of Carboniferous life than either record could provide alone. The primitive reptiles of the Carboniferous, the group that would give rise to lizards, snakes, crocodilians, turtles, dinosaurs, and birds, are documented in several period sites. Hylonomus of Nova Scotia, already mentioned as one of the most primitive known amniotes, is also considered one of the oldest primitive reptiles. Its fossils were found inside the hollow trunks of giant lycopsids, preserved in what were once the Carboniferous swamps of what was then the northern part of Pangea. The discovery history of Carboniferous fossils is itself a fascinating story that spans 2 centuries and multiple countries. The first scientific descriptions of Carboniferous plants were made by botanists studying coal measure rocks in Britain and Europe in the early 19th century. Charles Brongniart, the French paleobotanist, produced the first systematic work on fossil plants from Carboniferous deposits in the 1820s and 1830s, establishing the foundations of paleobotany as a scientific discipline. Those early paleobotanists recognized that the plants in the coal differed fundamentally from any living plant, and struggled to understand how such alien forms could have been the ancestors of the familiar modern plant world. The habitats that the first amniotes colonized in the Carboniferous were mainly those of the forest interior, away from the large water bodies where amphibians dominated. The Carboniferous forest interior, with its thick leaf litter floor and its abundant insects and other arthropods, was a habitat that amphibians could not efficiently exploit because they needed to stay moist and close to water. Small amniotes, with their scales reducing water loss through the skin, could venture further from water and colonize those interior forest habitats. The Joggins site in Nova Scotia, Canada, visited by Charles Darwin and Charles Lyell in the 19th century, contributed in important ways to the formulation of evolutionary theories. The hollow lycopsid trunks of Joggins with their fills of primitive amphibians and amniotes were direct evidence of the transition between amphibians and amniotes that evolutionary theory predicted but that had not been documented so clearly in any other world site. The phylogeny of Carboniferous primitive amniotes is one of the most active and most debated fields of vertebrate paleontology, because Carboniferous fossils are relatively scarce and in many cases fragmentary, making it difficult to establish kinship relationships among the various groups with desired precision. The most recent phylogenetic analyses, using character matrices with hundreds of anatomical features coded for dozens of taxa, have produced evolutionary trees of primitive amniotes that in some respects differ significantly from previous interpretations. The late Carboniferous, the last 20 or 30 million years of the period, was a time of important climatic changes that transformed ecosystems and prepared the ground for transition to the Permian. Those climatic changes were not abrupt, but gradual, yet their effects on the period's tropical forests were profound and ultimately irreversible. The late Carboniferous also saw the first clear examples of what paleontologists call ecological release, a phenomenon where organisms rapidly diversify in body size, diet, and ecological role when the constraints imposed by existing competitors or predators are removed. As the giant lycopsid forests fragmented and the ecological structure of tropical ecosystems was disrupted, the amniotes that had been small and secondarily important in those forests found themselves with new ecological space available. The late Carboniferous also shows something important about the relationship between biological diversity and ecological stability. The Carboniferous tropical forests, despite being dominated by a relatively small number of plant genera compared to modern tropical forests, maintained remarkable ecological stability for tens of millions of years. That stability was possible because the dominant organisms, the lycopsids and horsetails, were extremely well adapted to the specific conditions of the Carboniferous tropics and very efficient at exploiting those conditions. When those conditions changed, the ecosystem's low diversity made it more vulnerable to collapse than a more diverse system might have been. That lesson, that diversity can provide resilience against perturbation, is one of the most frequently cited principles in modern conservation biology, and its roots can be traced to the Carboniferous collapse. The late Carboniferous transition from tropical swamp to more seasonal woodland also had consequences for soil carbon dynamics that are still being studied through the geological record. The transition from peat-accumulating swamp to better-drained woodland soils changed the carbon storage efficiency of terrestrial ecosystems, contributing to changes in the atmospheric carbon cycle that fed back onto the climate transition itself. That kind of biosphere climate feedback, in which changes in vegetation alter the carbon cycle in ways that then alter the climate further, is central to modern climate change projections and is studied partly through comparison with geological examples like the late Carboniferous. The late Carboniferous climate change also had important effects on patterns of evolutionary innovation. Periods of environmental stress, when existing ecological structures are disrupted and new ecological opportunities are created, tend to be periods of accelerated evolutionary change. The late Carboniferous, with its collapsing forests and shifting climate, was exactly such a period for the terrestrial vertebrate fauna. The comparison between the rate of evolutionary change in amniotes during the stable mid-Carboniferous versus the rapidly changing late Carboniferous and early Permian shows a clear acceleration in the rate of morphological diversification in the latter period. More new body plans appeared, more new ecological strategies were tried, and more new lineages were established in the late Carboniferous and early Permian than in the stable periods before the climate changed. That pattern of accelerated evolution during periods of environmental disruption is one of the most consistent patterns in the fossil record. The rapid diversification of amniotes in the late Carboniferous and early Permian, from a starting point of small insectivores to a diverse array of large herbivores, large predators, and everything in between, is a textbook example of adaptive radiation. That radiation was driven precisely by the ecological opportunities created by the collapse of the Carboniferous forest ecosystem and the reduced competitive and predatory pressures that came with it. Understanding the Carboniferous collapse is thus essential for understanding the Permian radiation that followed it. The late Carboniferous climate became more variable and more seasonal. The Gondwana glaciation, which had maintained relative climatic stability in the tropics for most of the period, began showing more marked cycles of glacial advance and retreat. Those cycles produced sea level variations and precipitation distribution changes affecting tropical forests in ways the fossil record documents clearly. The late Carboniferous ecological transition also illustrates the concept of ecological legacy effects, the idea that the history of an ecosystem shapes its present in ways that are not always immediately visible. The soil chemistry of regions that were Carboniferous swamps is still influenced by the massive organic accumulation of that period, expressed today in the acidic, nutrient-poor soils characteristic of many coalfield regions. The groundwater chemistry of regions underlain by Carboniferous limestone is shaped by the slow dissolution of that limestone over millions of years. Those legacy effects connect the Carboniferous to the present in ways that are practically important for land use, agriculture, and water management in those regions. The causes of late Carboniferous climate change are still debated among paleoclimatologists, though there is general consensus on the main mechanisms involved. The movement of continents toward Pangea formation progressively reduced coastline length and increased the size of the continental interior, where the climate is more extreme and more variable than on coasts. That increased continentality was probably one of the factors contributing to the cooling and drying of the late Carboniferous climate. The fall in atmospheric carbon dioxide, produced by the massive burial of organic carbon in Carboniferous sediments, also contributed to cooling. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and when its atmospheric concentration falls, global temperature tends to drop. The Carboniferous was a period of sustained fall in atmospheric carbon dioxide as a direct consequence of carbon burial in the forests, and that fall was probably related to the cooling and Gondwana glaciation. The consequences of late Carboniferous climate change for period organisms are documented by the fossil record in ways having disturbing parallels with current changes. Organisms needing specific habitats to survive, like giant lycopsids requiring permanent swamps, were most affected by the climate changes. More generalist and more adaptable organisms survived better. That pattern of selective extinction of specialists and survival of generalists in response to rapid climate changes is exactly the pattern conservation biologists observe today in response to current climate change. The collapse of Carboniferous forests in the late period was not a single catastrophic event but a gradual process extending over several million years. But its consequences for the period's terrestrial ecosystems were so profound that paleontologists consider it one of the most important extinction events of the Paleozoic, though much less known than the 5 great extinctions in the geological record. The collapse of the Carboniferous forests also left a legacy in the geological record that geochemists can read with remarkable detail. The carbon isotope record of the late Carboniferous and early Permian shows dramatic shifts reflecting the changes in carbon burial rates as the forests contracted and the efficiency of wood decomposition increased. Those isotope shifts, recorded in marine carbonates and in organic carbon from terrestrial sediments, provide an independent confirmation of the biological and climatic changes documented by fossils and sediment structures. The Carboniferous-Permian transition is also one of the clearest geological examples of what ecologists call a regime shift, a rapid transition from one stable ecological state to another that is resistant to returning to the previous state. The Carboniferous swamp forest was a stable ecological regime maintained by feedbacks between the forest and its environment. The forest produced the humid conditions that sustained the forest. The carbon burial in the swamps maintained the low CO2 and mild climate that allowed the forest to thrive. When those feedbacks were disrupted by continental drift and changing orbital parameters, the system could not return to its previous state. It shifted to the Permian regime of conifer-dominated, more seasonal landscapes, which was itself maintained by different but equally self-reinforcing feedbacks. Understanding how ecological regime shifts occur in geological history is directly relevant to understanding the risks of such shifts in modern ecosystems under climate change. The scientific community studying the Carboniferous is international and interdisciplinary, bringing together paleobotanists studying the fossil plants, paleoentomologists studying the fossil insects, vertebrate paleontologists studying the fossil animals, sedimentologists studying the rocks containing those fossils, geochemists studying the chemical signals in those rocks, and climate modelers simulating the atmospheric and oceanic conditions of the period. That interdisciplinary collaboration is necessary because no single discipline can provide all the evidence needed to reconstruct the full complexity of the Carboniferous world. The study of those geochemical signals from the late Carboniferous has been particularly important for calibrating the models used to understand the global carbon cycle. Because the Carboniferous represents the most extreme episode of organic carbon burial in the last 500 million years, understanding the geochemical signatures of that burial provides essential constraints on the behavior of the carbon cycle under conditions very different from today's. Those constraints in turn improve the accuracy of the models used to project how the carbon cycle will respond to current and future perturbations. The pollen records of the late Carboniferous and early Permian document that collapse unequivocally. The types of spores and pollens characterizing mid-Carboniferous lycopsid and tree horsetail forests disappear or become much less abundant in late Carboniferous sediments, replaced by pollens from plants more adapted to seasonal conditions. The evolutionary success of the amniotes after the Carboniferous was not simply a matter of having the right body plan in the right place at the right time. It was also a matter of behavioral and physiological flexibility. The amniotes that inherited the Permian from the late Carboniferous were not pre-adapted for the specific conditions of the Permian. They were adaptable, capable of evolving new solutions to new problems faster than the more constrained amphibians could. That adaptability, rooted in the reproductive independence from water that the amniote egg provided, was the foundation of their long-term success. It is not coincidence that amniotes today occupy every terrestrial habitat on the planet, from high-altitude deserts to tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, while amphibians remain largely restricted to moist environments. The collapse of lycopsid forests had direct consequences for the organisms depending on those forests. The giant insects needing the high oxygen concentration produced by those forests began disappearing as atmospheric oxygen fell with forest reduction. The amphibians needing permanent swamps for reproduction found their habitats becoming more seasonal and less reliable. Without the giant lycopsids as dominant plants, the role of primary producer passed to other groups. Primitive conifers at middle and high latitudes, seed ferns in the tropics. Those new primary producers had different properties from the lycopsids, with wood more resistant to decomposition in some cases, with different leaf structures and different spore or seed production rates. Those differences in the ecology of the new primary producers in turn changed the ecology of herbivores and decomposers, producing Permian ecosystems that, though superficially similar to Carboniferous ones, were structurally and functionally distinct. The late Carboniferous extinction, though not having the dramatic scale of the 5 major extinctions, was an inflection point in life's history. It marked the end of the age of giant lycopsids and dominant amphibians, and the beginning of the rise of amniotes that would culminate in the Permian Therapsid world and eventually in the dinosaur and mammal world. The Carboniferous was the last act of one era and the prologue of the next. When the Carboniferous ended 299 million years ago and the Permian began, the world was not empty. The groups that had survived forest collapse and the climatic pressures of the late Carboniferous were those that would inherit the Permian and that through the Permian would connect the Carboniferous to the modern world. The legacy of the Carboniferous in modern ecology is also visible in the distribution of coal beds and the ecosystems that develop on the soils overlying them. In regions of the American Appalachians and the European coal fields, the soils derived from Carboniferous shales and mudstones have distinct chemical properties reflecting the organic richness of the original Carboniferous sediments. Those soils support distinctive plant communities that differ from communities on other rock types, creating a biological legacy of the Carboniferous that is visible in today's vegetation patterns. The legacy of the Carboniferous in human language is also more extensive than we might think. The very word coal comes ultimately from Old English call, itself from Proto-Germanic, tracing the importance of that substance in the cultures that mined it for centuries. Carbon, the element, takes its name from Latin carbo, meaning charcoal or coal. Carbonate, the mineral group including limestone and chalk, takes its name from the same root. Carboniferous, the geological period, means literally coal-bearing. The entire vocabulary of chemistry built on the carbon element, from carbon dioxide to hydrocarbons to carbohydrates, traces its naming ultimately to those ancient Carboniferous forests and the charcoal and coal they produced. The industrial coal that built the modern world also carries cultural and social history that is inseparable from its geological history. The coal mining communities of Wales, Yorkshire, the Ruhr Valley, the Appalachians, Silesia, have cultures, traditions, and identities shaped by centuries of working with the fossilized forests of the Carboniferous. The labor movements that transformed the political landscape of industrial nations had their origins in the dangerous and demanding work of extracting Carboniferous coal from the earth. The environmental consequences of burning that coal, now reshaping the global climate, will also reshape the futures of those communities as the energy transition proceeds. Understanding the Carboniferous is thus not only scientifically important. It is also culturally and historically important for understanding the communities that built their lives around the legacy of those ancient forests, and for understanding the social dimensions of the energy transition that is now underway. The reclamation of coal-mined lands, where the surface has been disturbed by mining operations, often reveals directly the Carboniferous heritage of those areas. Paleosols, ancient soils preserved within the Carboniferous sedimentary sequence, are sometimes exposed by mining operations, providing paleontologists and paleopedologists with direct windows into the soil conditions of the Carboniferous swamp environment. Those ancient soils, with their preserved root traces, fungal hyphae, and soil fauna burrows, show that the biological activity of Carboniferous forest soils was at least as intense as that of modern forest soils. Amphibians survived the Carboniferous, though with reduced diversity and a more limited ecological role. The large predator amphibians of the Carboniferous swamps gave rise in the Permian to groups like Archaeops and other equally formidable amphibians. But the dominance amphibians had in the Carboniferous would never return. In the Permian, amniotes began occupying the large herbivore and large predator niches that had previously been reserved for amphibians. The carbon footprint of the modern world is measured in gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. Those gigatons come primarily from combusting the organic carbon stored in Carboniferous coal, Jurassic and Cretaceous petroleum, and Permian natural gas. Understanding the timescales over which that carbon was accumulated, tens to hundreds of millions of years, and the timescales over which we are releasing it, decades to centuries, is essential for appreciating the scale of the perturbation we are creating. The geological record does not provide exact precedents for what we are doing, because no natural process has released geological carbon at quite this speed. But the geological record does provide boundary conditions. It shows what kinds of climate conditions are associated with different atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, and it shows how long climate perturbations persist once initiated. The biological legacy of the Carboniferous in the modern world is deeper and more ramified than might seem at first glance. Not only in the coal we burn or the oxygen we breathe, but in the biology of virtually all complex terrestrial organisms. The vascular land plants, including all modern ferns, conifers, cycads, and flowering plants, descend from the groups that diversified in the Carboniferous. The fungi decomposing dead wood in modern forests are also Carboniferous heirs. The centipedes and millipedes today living in moist forest floors are direct heirs of the Carboniferous forest floor arthropods. The heritage of the Carboniferous also includes some aspects of modern biogeography that are only comprehensible in the context of Pangea's history. The current distribution of some organism groups, like the platyrrhine monkeys of South America and the catarrhine monkeys of Africa and Asia, or the distribution of marsupials in Australia and South America, has its roots in the vicissitudes of Pangea's formation and breakup, which began in the Carboniferous and continued during the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. The insects that survived the Carboniferous in size-reduced forms, but in many cases increased diversity, became the starting point for one of the most spectacular evolutionary radiations in animal history. The insect orders most diverse and most successful today, beetles, flies, hymenopterans, began their evolutionary radiations in the Permian and Triassic, benefiting from the more open and more diverse world that emerged after the collapse of the Carboniferous forests. The most tangible Carboniferous legacy in the modern world is coal, and the history of that coal is also the history of the Industrial Revolution and the most profound transformation human societies have experienced in the last 2 centuries. The relationship between Carboniferous coal and the climate change it is producing when burned is one of the most dramatic examples of geological timescales intersecting with human timescales. Geologists think in millions of years. Engineers and economists think in decades. And the gap between those timescales is at the heart of the challenge of understanding why burning fossil fuels is environmentally consequential. The petroleum and natural gas, also classified as fossil fuels, though they formed in different geological periods from coal, share with Carboniferous coal the fundamental property of being ancient organic carbon that has been removed from the active carbon cycle for tens of millions to hundreds of millions of years. The burning of those fuels is returning that ancient carbon to the active carbon cycle at rates that have no precedent in recent geological history, except possibly the largest volcanic episodes like the Siberian traps. That comparison between the rate of carbon release from fossil fuel burning and the rate of carbon release during major geological events is one of the most important contexts for understanding the unprecedented nature of current climate change. When a coal geologist looks at a seam of Carboniferous coal, she sees 300 million years of geological history compressed into a black band of rock. When an energy economist looks at the same seam, he sees a quantity of energy with a monetary value. When a climate scientist looks at it, she sees a quantity of carbon dioxide waiting to be released into the atmosphere. All 3 perspectives are correct, And all three are necessary to understand the full significance of what that coal represents. The Carboniferous period, perhaps more than any other in Earth's history, demonstrates why geological knowledge matters for understanding the world we inhabit today. Carboniferous coal began being used as fuel in China more than 2,000 years ago, and in Europe during the Middle Ages, mainly in regions where coal outcrops at the surface made the mineral easily accessible. But it was from the 18th century onward, with James Watt's development of the steam engine and the progressive mechanization of industrial production, that Carboniferous coal became the engine of the world. The Carboniferous period's name itself is a reminder of the practical importance of geological knowledge. When geologists in the early 19th century named the period based on its characteristic coal deposits, they were reflecting the enormous economic importance of those deposits to the industrializing societies of their time. The geological periods are not named randomly. The Jurassic takes its name from the Jura Mountains where its characteristic rocks were first studied. The Cretaceous takes its name from the Latin for chalk, reflecting the characteristic white chalk formations of that period in Europe. The Devonian takes its name from Devon in southwestern England where its characteristic rocks were first described. Each name carries a history of human engagement with the geological world, of people noticing patterns in rocks and trying to make sense of them. The coal mines of Great Britain, whose coal formed approximately 300 million years ago in Carboniferous swamps, powered the first textile factories of Manchester and Leeds, the first iron foundries of Birmingham and Sheffield, the first steam locomotives connecting cities previously separated by days of travel. That coal, that carbon buried 300 million years ago in the swamps of giant lycopsids, was what made possible the industrialization that in 2 centuries transformed the structure of human society more profoundly than in the previous 10,000 years. There is something profoundly ironic in that history. The Carboniferous forests buried carbon for tens of millions of years, reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide and increasing oxygen, producing a world with more oxygen than existed before and than exists today. And we, in barely 200 years, are undoing that work by burning the carbon those forests took tens of millions of years to bury. That carbon return process has already measurable consequences. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased from the 280 parts per million of the pre-industrial era to more than 420 parts per million today, the highest level in at least 3 million years. The Carboniferous, with its massive carbon burial and its documented climatic consequences in the geological record, is one of the most valuable natural experiments Earth has produced to calibrate the climate models used to project future changes. When those models attempt to predict how the climate will respond to rising carbon dioxide, they are in part tested against what actually happened when the Carboniferous forests buried that same gas over millions of years. There is a connection between the Carboniferous and human biology that goes far beyond dependence on coal as an energy source. It is a genealogical, phylogenetic connection, written in our genome and in our anatomy. Humans are amniotes. We are synapsids. We are the result of an evolutionary chain that began in the Carboniferous with the first amniotes that invented the egg capable of surviving on dry land. Without that egg, without that invention from 320 million years ago, terrestrial vertebrates could never have colonized all terrestrial habitats of the planet. Without that colonization, the diversification of Permian therapsids and Mesozoic mammals would not have occurred. Without that diversification, the Cenozoic primates would not have existed. Without those primates, humans would not have evolved. The Carboniferous also left its mark in human culture in ways that go beyond energy and materials. The imagery of the primordial swamp, the ancient and mysterious forest of giant ferns and strange creatures, appears repeatedly in literature and art as a symbol of the primitive, the alien, the deep past. Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World, published in 1912, drew on paleontological knowledge of the Carboniferous and other ancient periods to create a vision of a plateau in South America where prehistoric life had survived to the present. H. G. Wells used similar imagery in his scientific romances. Those cultural uses of Carboniferous imagery reflect a broader human fascination with deep time and with the question of what the world was like before human history, a fascination that the actual science of the period continues to feed with its extraordinary revelations. The connection between the Carboniferous and the genetic structure of modern organisms extends beyond the amniote lineage. The genes controlling the development of limbs in all tetrapods, the genes regulating the formation of the amniotic membranes, the genes encoding the enzymes allowing vertebrates to process oxygen efficiently at the cellular level, all have their evolutionary origins in the Paleozoic, with many key innovations occurring in the Carboniferous or the periods immediately surrounding it. The legacy of the Carboniferous in the evolution of the vertebrate immune system is also worth considering. The transition to a fully terrestrial lifestyle, completed by the amniotes in the late Carboniferous and early Permian, exposed those organisms to a new range of pathogens and parasites that had not previously posed challenges to their aquatic ancestors. The evolution of the vertebrate adaptive immune system, which allows learning and memory of specific pathogens, was driven in part by the challenges of dealing with the diverse microbial world of terrestrial environments. Some of the most ancient components of the vertebrate immune system, including certain families of immune receptor genes, were already established in the Carboniferous tetrapods and have been maintained throughout the subsequent evolution of all amniote lineages. Modern developmental genetics has revealed that the genetic toolkit for building a vertebrate body is remarkably conserved across the entire group, from fish to humans. The same regulatory genes that control the development of fins in fish control the development of arms and legs in humans, with modifications that alter the timing and pattern of their expression. That deep conservation of the genetic toolkit reflects the common ancestry of all vertebrates in the Devonian and the subsequent Carboniferous diversification that built upon that shared ancestral toolkit to produce the extraordinary diversity of body forms we see today. The membranes surrounding the human embryo in the uterus, the amnion and the chorion, are directly homologous to the membranes of the amniote egg that allowed the first Carboniferous reptiles to reproduce on dry land. The fluid surrounding the developing human fetus, the amniotic fluid, is the internal version of the same aqueous environment the amniote egg created to protect the embryo from desiccation 300 million years ago. We carry the Carboniferous inside us in the most literal biological sense. The anatomy of modern amphibians also carries Carboniferous marks. The aquatic larvae of frogs and salamanders, with their external gills and water dependence, are essentially miniaturizations of the Carboniferous aquatic amphibians that dominated the ancient swamps. The metamorphosis transforming an aquatic larva into a terrestrial adult recapitulates in individual development the evolutionary transition that vertebrates made in the Devonian when they left the water. Each tadpole transforming into a frog is repeating, in a few weeks, an evolutionary story that took millions of years to occur. Our fears and fascinations also carry traces of Carboniferous evolutionary history. The instinctive fear many people feel toward large insects and arthropods could be in part a legacy of the times when Carboniferous giant arthropods were a real threat to the small vertebrates living with them. The amygdala, the brain structure processing fear responses, is one of the most evolutionarily ancient parts of the mammalian brain, shaped by selection pressures operating over hundreds of millions of years, including the Carboniferous. 300 million years is a time that human intuition cannot directly absorb. We can pronounce the words, write the number, but the reality of that quantity of time is inaccessible to direct perception. We need reference frameworks to approach it. The deep history of the Carboniferous also connects to one of the most fundamental questions in science, the question of life's long-term persistence on Earth. The geological record shows that life on Earth has survived everything the planet has thrown at it for nearly 4 billion years, including impacts, glaciations, and mass extinctions far more severe than anything humans have yet caused. The Carboniferous is part of that record of persistence, a period when life not only survived but transformed the planet in ways that are still felt today. The final minutes before sleep are a good time to let the Carboniferous settle. To let the giant lycopsids rise in the imagination, their diamond-patterned bark reaching 30 meters above a dark swamp. To let the Meganeura hover for a moment over that swamp, its wings catching the oxygen-rich air of a world we will never see. To let the first amniote lay its egg in the leaf litter, unaware that it is beginning one of the most important evolutionary lineages in the history of life on Earth. The Carboniferous ultimately offers us what all deep time does: perspective. The perspective that the world we inhabit is one of many worlds this planet has hosted, each complete in itself, each populated by organisms perfectly adapted to its conditions, each ending and giving way to something new. We are the current world, and the Carboniferous is one of the worlds that came before. Between them lies 300 million years of evolutionary change, extinction, and renewal that produced the biological richness of the present. That richness, which we are currently affecting through our own geological scale activities, is the latest expression of a creativity that the Carboniferous demonstrated in its giant lycopsids and its oxygen-drunk dragonflies. Understanding how that creativity works, how it produced the Carboniferous from the Devonian and the Permian from the Carboniferous, is part of what it means to be the kind of species that can look back at its own origins across 300 million years of time. Those moments, 300 million years ago on this same planet, were real. The animals that inhabited them were as real as any animal alive today. They ate, they reproduced, they competed, they died, and in dying they left the records we read in the rock and the legacies we carry in our genes. The Carboniferous is not a separate world from ours. It is the deep past of the same world, connected to the present by an unbroken thread of life that runs from those first amniotes in the lycopsid forest to the thinking, breathing creature reading about them tonight. That perspective of deep time persistence does not mean that current environmental changes are trivial or that life will necessarily emerge from them unaffected. The mass extinctions in Earth's history were catastrophic for the species that lived through them, even though life as a whole persisted and eventually recovered. What it does mean is that the question of life's persistence on Earth and the question of the persistence of specific species and ecosystems are very different questions operating on very different timescales. The Carboniferous helps us hold both of those questions in mind simultaneously. The most useful framework geologists have developed is compressing all of Earth's history into a single calendar year, with Earth's formation on January 1st and the current moment at midnight on December 31st. In that scale, each calendar day equals approximately 12 million years of real history. In that compressed calendar, the first multicellular animals of the Cambrian appear in late November. The first terrestrial vertebrates of the Devonian appear in early December. The Carboniferous, with its forests of giant lycopsids and seagull-sized insects, occupies approximately December 14th to 19th. The dinosaurs appear around December 25th. The primates appear December 30th. Modern humans appear at 11:45 in the evening of December 31st. And all of written human history, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present, occupies the last 10 seconds of the year. In that perspective, the Carboniferous is relatively close to the end of the year, in the days before Christmas. But that closeness is deceptive because in absolute terms, 300 million years is an enormous time. Another framework that can be more intuitive than time for some people is distance. If we represented all of Earth's history as a 10-kilometer walk, each meter would equal 450,000 years. The Carboniferous, with its 60 million year duration, would occupy approximately 130 meters of that walk. All of human history, from the first hominids 6 million years ago, would occupy the last 13 meters. And all written history would occupy barely 1 centimeter. In that representation, the Carboniferous is 130 meters from the end of a 10-kilometer walk. It is near the end in geological terms, but far from the end in terms of our intuitive perception of time. That proximity of the Carboniferous in the total scale of Earth's history contrasts with its radical alienness in terms of the organisms and ecosystems characterizing it. Being relatively close in time but radically different in contents is one of the most disconcerting aspects of the Carboniferous, and also one of the most revealing about the speed at which evolution can transform the world. Tonight we have explored a world that existed 300 million years ago and that in many respects is stranger than any science fiction planet. The lycopsid forests 30 meters tall with no equivalent before or after. The seagull-sized insects hunting in the warm, oxygen-saturated air. The 3-meter amphibians wading motionless in the black swamp water, as patient and lethal as the crocodiles that would come hundreds of millions of years later. The first amniotes, small and discreet, silently inventing the egg that would forever change the history of terrestrial vertebrates. That world, that Carboniferous, no longer exists. The giant lycopsids are now coal in the subsoil of Europe and North America. The insects flying beneath the canopy of those trees are now fossils in Carboniferous sandstones of Ohio and Belgium. The swamps sheltering all that extraordinary world are now the sedimentary basins where petroleum geologists search for the fuels powering modern civilization. But something of that world persists. The oxygen you breathe tonight is the air of the oxygen those lycopsid forests produced. The structure of your fetal membranes is the inheritance of the amniote egg those first Carboniferous reptiles invented. The carbon of your body has passed through countless forms over 300 million years, but at some point it was the carbon those giant lycopsids fixed through photosynthesis. We are, in that profound sense, Carboniferous creatures. Not in a mystical sense but in the most literal and most biological sense possible. We are the descendants of organisms that lived in that period, and we carry in our bodies and genomes the inheritance of the evolutionary solutions those organisms developed to survive in that strange world. But tonight is not the moment for preoccupations. Tonight is the moment for wonder. For wonder at a world that existed and was completely real, with its giant lycopsids and seagull-sized dragonflies, with its patient amphibians in the black swamp water and its first reptiles in the forest leaf litter. A world that existed for 60 million years and left its legacy in the coal of our soils and the oxygen of our air and the biology of our bodies. The Carboniferous also teaches us something about the timescale of natural processes particularly relevant in the current context. The environmental problems we face as human society tend to be discussed on timescales of decades or centuries. But geological processes operate on scales of millions of years, and their effects are proportional to those scales. The Carboniferous forests buried over 60 million years cannot be safely returned to the cycle in 200 years without proportional consequences. That asymmetry between the slowness of natural processes and the speed of human activities is perhaps the deepest lesson the Carboniferous has to offer us. The swamp is still there, in some way, beneath our feet. Not as water and mud and living lycopsids, but as coal and gas and oil, as the limestone rocks containing the fossils of its seas, as the molecular structure of the DNA we share with all living amniotes. The story of the Carboniferous did not end 300 million years ago. It continues right now, in every breath, in every heartbeat, in the biology of the body that tonight seeks rest. Sleep comes now over that 300 million year foundation, over the forests that became coal, over the amphibians that gave way to reptiles, over the oxygen the lycopsids put in the air that we are still breathing. There is something deeply calming in that continuity, in the idea that we are part of a process that began long before we existed and will continue long after we have disappeared. If this journey kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are many more worlds waiting to be explored in the dark.